All right, I will give you a few minutes to find the spot on the top of page 37 that says "If You're King." So I'll give you a few seconds to find that, and then we'll get started. All right, here we go. "If your king has sent me presents," he replied, "I also am a king, and this is my land. Your father, Captain Newport, is to come to me, not I to him, nor yet to your fort." So they had to take the bed and the crown and the other gifts the long way around by water. Captain Newport insisted that they be accompanied by 120 men. He took 70 with him by river. John Smith took 50 by land. When they had all gathered at Wareham-a-Kokomo, Powhatan took his place on his throne and waited. By this time he would have heard from Namontack about what kind of place England was. Stone towers, tall houses with floors on top of floors, long bridges, chariots to carry people around. It was more than Powhatan could imagine or wanted to imagine. He was glum. Even the trumpet which announced Newport must have been an irritation in his present mood. Powhatan went through the motions that were expected of him. However, receiving the bed, the ewer, the jug, the finger ring sent by an English nobleman, but when it came to the scarlet coat, he balked. Captain Newport wanted him to put it on then and there. Why? Was there some kind of bad magic in it? Namontack told him it was safe to put it on, so he did, but he wasn't happy about it. But when he was told to kneel so the crown could be put on his head, Powhatan absolutely refused. Even though Namontack said that kneeling was just part of the English custom, he wouldn't do it. He knew that English went on their knees when they were talked to their God, and he wouldn't be tricked into doing anything he didn't understand. Finally, one of the men pushed down on his shoulder so that in spite of himself, Powhatan stooped slightly. Quickly, Captain Newport clapped the copper crown on Powhatan's bent head. Outside the longhouse, the English fired guns to mark the occasion, but Powhatan was annoyed by all the fuss. He had always been a king. He didn't need the English to make him one again. Of course, he knew that he was expected to give gifts in return for the crown that he didn't want and the coat that he didn't trust. So in an offhand way, he handed Newport the deerskin mantle he'd been wearing. He tossed in a pair of his old moccasins and ordered a measly 7 bushels of corn to be presented to the English. It was just as John Smith had said. Powhatan would become prouder and stingier. But in fact, the coronation probably had little to do with his change of attitude. Crown or no crown, Powhatan had just enough of the English, who could build stone towers and make guns, but couldn't even feed themselves. After the English left, Powhatan told his people they were not to trade with them any more. He told Pocahontas she was not to visit Jamestown. Her friendship with John Smith was over. The English were their enemies. Pocahontas understood that there was nothing more important to her people than loyalty to the tribe. Had she not felt that closeness at every sunrise and every sunset? Had she not celebrated that closeness every time she danced? Yet it was her father who had made John Smith her brother, and how could she order him out of her mind? How could she pretend that John was her enemy? So if you realize what's going on, Powhatan was insulted by King James sending over all of that stuff and saying that he was going to be a king under King James. I feel like I would be kind of insulted too. They're kind of making a joke of Powhatan being a king and not being their type of king, you know. He didn't believe in the God. He didn't do what the King of England did. But so what? So they sent all these gifts, and John Smith thought that they could get Powhatan to go to Jamestown, right? And to receive the gifts that way. But Powhatan refused. So they had to carry 14 miles, like from here to Brattleboro. They had to carry a bed by hand and a bunch of other things. Jackets and pretty heavy stuff. So imagine that. So he did that, waited for him on his throne to kind of prove a point. And when John Smith and his men got there, he refused to accept the gifts. He wanted them to know that he was a god. I mean, he was a king no matter what, just because it wasn't like their normal king. So I think that if he had kind of a right to be insulted. But then he got so mad that he what? He took away Pocahontas from ever going back there. And how is she feeling? Not so good. She was sad. She was upset with her father because she enjoyed going to visit them, and she enjoyed playing with the kids and watching John Smith work. So it's disappointing, and I'm anxious to see what's going to happen next, since Powhatan has now declared that the Englishmen are the Native Americans' enemies. So let's keep reading. Yet, John did become an enemy to her people. No matter what he had to do, he was going to see that the English settlement survived. He couldn't get corn by trade. He'd fight for it. He'd burn down houses, if that's what he had to do. He destroyed what the Indians valued most, their canoes, whittled and carved out of tree trunks with such effort, such care, but he would feed his people. Captain Newport was unhappy about all the clashes, and when he went back to London in December, he reported that he certainly had been friendly to the natives. He described the nice coronation he'd given Powhatan. Indeed, he'd carried out all of his instructions, although he admitted there was not much to show for it, only a few samples of glass and pitch and tar, but no gold. No sign of an ocean, although he'd gone around the falls as he'd been told to, except he hadn't bothered with the barge. In addition, Newport delivered John Smith's map and a blistering letter from John which blamed the London Company for Jamestown's troubles. How could people in London know, John asked, what instructions to give a country they'd never seen? He's got a good point, right? They were giving them instructions to go explore all this land and do all these things, but the London Company had never even been to Jamestown. And how could they expect the kind of men they'd been sending to Jamestown to succeed at anything? The company kept sending gentlemen who would not work, laborers without skills, runaways, and condemned men. The scum of the world, John called them, and troublemakers like Ratcliffe, who was returning now with Newport, and Archer, who had already returned. Never let those two return to Jamestown, he wrote. So John Smith is feeling pretty angry because the people that they're sending over to build this new land aren't the most skilled people. So they don't know how to build houses. They don't know how to run a colony. They don't know how to be president and to navigate the ocean and things like that. So they're people who aren't totally skilled, which can be pretty frustrating. Back in Jamestown, however, John had made some of the improvements he had planned. Just as he had predicted, all it took was a pitcher of cold water poured down the sleeve to discourage a man from using bad language. And with his encouragement, there was more attention to business. But it was hard for men to work when they were hungry, and because there were so little trade, they were hungry most of the time. So in January of 1609, when Powhatan suddenly sent John an invitation to visit and the promise of a boatload of corn, John quickly accepted. In return, of course, Powhatan made demands: an English house, a grindstone, copper, and beads, 50 swords, some guns, a rooster, and a hen. John did send 2 Dutchmen and 2 Englishmen ahead to start building a house, but he was not giving in to all Powhatan's demands. When he and 47 guards arrived at Wareham-Kokomo, 2 weeks later, he had copper and beads with him, probably a rooster and a hen, possibly a grindstone, but certainly no swords and no guns. As it turned out, sending the men ahead to build the house had been a mistake. By the time John arrived, the Dutchmen had decided that life under Powhatan was better than life under John Smith. They decided to stay with Powhatan and promised to get him guns from the settlement. Furthermore, they told him that if he wanted to get rid of the English, he should first get rid of John Smith. This time, when John Smith arrived, there were no shouts of greeting for him, no platters of bread to welcome him. Powhatan received him coldly. What was John Smith doing here, he asked. He hadn't been sent for. Not sent for, John pointed to the messengers who had come to Jamestown. How could he be so forgetful? Powhatan laughed. But he was not going to be tricked into easy dealings. If there were any trading to be done, Powhatan said, John Smith should understand that he was not interested in anything but swords and guns. Told you long ago, John replied. I had none to spare. But Captain Newport had given him swords, Powhatan said. He had put away his guns when asked. Why couldn't John do the same? After all, Powhatan was John's father. As his son and chief, John would do what his father asked. John wished no further misunderstanding. Powhatan, he said, you must know I honor but one king, and I live here not as your subject, but as your friend. No, not as a friend, Powhatan replied. Captain Smith many do inform me, he said. Your coming hither is not for trade, but to invade my people and possess my country. All the time that Powhatan had been talking, his warriors had been secretly gathering around his house. And now Powhatan made an excuse to leave the building. With his wives and children, Powhatan ran away, leaving behind several women to entertain John and keep him from being suspicious. But after a while, John did become suspicious. He had only 18 men on shore, who of course were far outnumbered by the natives, but as it turned out, John didn't need his men. He surprised the warriors who were secretly trying to block his exit, fired his pistol into the group, and at his first shot, they all fled. Pocahontas was one of the children who Powhatan took with him on his flight. She would have seen the frightened warriors streaking into the woods to tell her father that his plot had failed. She would have watched her father try to smooth things over by sending John a pearl bracelet and chain and an apology for his absence. She also knew that there was already a new plot for doing away with John Smith. She wanted to warn John, but how could she? Yet when evening came, Pocahontas could not help herself. When no one was looking, she slipped away from her family and ran through the woods until she came to the place where the English were staying. She waited for a chance to speak to John alone. So, things aren't going so well for the Native Americans and the English. They are now fighting, right? Powhatan thinks that he needs to get rid of John Smith. And it's kind of sad because John Smith's own people told him that. Told him that the only way to cooperate and get along is if John Smith is killed or gotten rid of, sent back home. And his own people told him that. So Powhatan has all these plots to try to kill John Smith, which, do you think Pocahontas is going to be very happy about that? No, I don't think so. So we're going to stop there. We're going to find out what happens next tomorrow. So please fill out your reading log. Write down any questions you might have or any vocabulary that you might be wondering about, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay? So get out your reading log and fill in that reading section. If you have any questions, come find me.